Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the journalist Zoe Schiffer. She is managing editor of Platform, former senior reporter for The Verge, and the author of the brand new book, Extremely Hardcore, Inside Elon Musk's Twitter. Zoe Schiffer, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's start with Twitter, aka X. Perhaps begin by telling us, I think everyone knows what Twitter is, but why Twitter is important. Why Twitter is the subject for an entire book that has taken you a lot of research and a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter's cultural relevance always really outpaced its kind of underlying business fundamentals. It had, for a long time, the most important people across sports, media, politics, tech. And if you wanted to know the conversation on the internet was on any given day, it really felt like you had to be on Twitter. And particularly for journalists, it was such a crucial tool for breaking news. And during protests, it was kind of the go-to platform to start social movements, that it really did have this big cultural relevance before Elon Musk bought the platform.
Yeah, you cite some statistics in the book that I didn't know about, which is I didn't realize just how much smaller Twitter is actually than Facebook. You said Twitter in 2020 had 192 million active users. Facebook had 1.84 billion. Twitter had 5% of Facebook's revenue. And yet there is something to Twitter where they're talked about, in the same breath, and Facebook doesn't drive the conversation and never did in the same way.
Yeah, I think Mark Zuckerberg described Twitter as a clown car that fell into a gold mine. And it really did feel that way, that they kind of accidentally reached this place of enormous success, even though the business model was almost entirely reliant on ads. And Twitter's underlying ad stack was completely paled in comparison to Facebook and Google's. And yet it did have significance in the culture, regardless of the fact that it really lagged behind its closest competitors in terms of growth, size, and revenue.
There is this extraordinary thing. I think a lot of us who have to use Twitter professionally have a very love-hate relationship with it, where on the one hand, and this is before, even pre-Elon Musk, it is a repulsive platform in many ways. It's full of a lot of angry people. It's full of a lot of insults, but it's also full of a lot of very, very funny jokes. It's full of a lot of things that you wouldn't find out anywhere else. And it's the one place where you can be mean to someone famous and they might get mad at you. You might get under their skin.
I know, it's such a ridiculous platform in that way. And I think all of us who've used it and had to use it professionally have that tension within us that we have to be on it, but we kind of hate it, but we're also completely addicted to it. I think the phenomenon that so encapsulates this is like the main character of Twitter, that on any given day, it could be a famous person, or it could be Elon Musk, or it could be just a random person who said something, and they could be completely canceled, or their tweet could go completely viral because it was really funny. And it was like never clear whether being that main character was actually a good thing or a bad thing. But regardless, the platform dynamics lent itself to kind of elevating random voices on any given day.
Yeah, here's the person we're all going to make fun of today. And you're just a random person who had 100 followers. And then all of a sudden you said something that was so unbelievably stupid that millions of people now want to mock you for it.
Yeah, or you lose your job. I mean, there's such famous examples of, Justine Sacco being the kind of quintessential one, made a joke on an airplane and then lands. The joke is pretty racist and she's fired from her job. It becomes national news. It's, it completely, I would think, changed her life.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you point out that I didn't quite understand until reading it in your book is that, Elon Musk's Twitter is chaos, dysfunction, but internally, the Twitter as a corporation wasn't necessarily that well run before Elon Musk. You talk to a lot of people who worked there during the Jack Dorsey years, and Twitter always had its fair share of problems internally as a company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the dynamics that made it a really nice place to work, and sometimes that even made it a good place to be on the internet, also kind of set the stage for Elon Musk to be able to take over, because Jack Dorsey in particular didn't seem to have a huge interest in revenue growth. This was actually something employees complained about, that he seemed very apathetic about the stock price. He wasn't interested in monetization in the way that they were. And Twitter was just incredibly slow and inefficient. Any project needed to go through many, many layers of management before it could get out the door. Products would get started or features would kind of begin, and then they would work on them for 2 years and they would never ship. And so there was a lot of frustration internally with kind of the lack of innovation at Twitter. Mark Zuckerberg at Meta, his motto at the outset was move fast and break things. And Twitter was kind of the opposite. It was move very, very slow and try very hard to get things right, which was a noble aspiration, but it meant often that they didn't do much of anything at all.
Yeah, the platform, and again, not something I quite realized until I read your writing and thought about it, hasn't changed at all. Pre-Elon Musk, it's the same, I can't remember when they introduced the slightly more characters, but it's the same at the beginning as it is years later.
And so many of the features that we think of as fundamental to Twitter, being able to @ someone, quote, tweet someone, having hashtags, those were all things that actually came from the user base. It wasn't like Twitter product managers were necessarily out there innovating. It was that the users would demand a way to organize the conversation. They would start adopting these norms, and then they would literally beg Twitter to codify them in the actual feature set. And eventually Twitter would cave and do that.
Now, there's a real dark side to this platform, and there certainly was pre-Elon Musk, which is that, yes, on the one hand, it's a clown car in some ways, and, it's just silly jokes, and it's memes, and it's insults, and whatever. But the company had always struggled with the fact that it can be a hotbed of false information and poisonous racist propaganda, and they have always struggled with, what do you do when you open up to the voices of millions of anonymous people? And you talk to a lot of people who were involved in the very difficult project of trying to figure out how to do content moderation.
Yeah, this conversation, unfortunately, today has become so politicized that it really lacks nuance. But for a really long time, Twitter's stance on this was the more free speech, the better. And so they had very little content moderation on the platform. Black users in particular complained of rampant harassment. Women complained of rampant harassment, and the platform essentially did nothing to stop it. And it became a huge issue. At one point, Disney was toying with the idea of acquiring Twitter, and it didn't. And it pulled out of the deal, citing harassment specifically as the kind of issue that it just wasn't prepared to take on. So this had real business consequences. In 2020, 2021, when we started to see the rise of health misinformation, the rise of QAnon, Twitter started to take this a lot more seriously, and particularly when Donald Trump started to run his campaign around 2016, there was kind of a change that began in terms of Twitter wanting to take more responsibility to be more proactive around content moderation. But the way that this has been spun is that Twitter was full of lefty liberals who were trying to censor conservatives. And it's actually, when we look at the data, we see the opposite, that conservative voices were augmented on the platform, that they were able to gain more prominence. And Twitter employees that I've spoken to took enormous pains in deciding, do we add even a small label to one of Donald Trump's tweets that's, spreading misinformation about mail-in ballots? And they would really argue about this decision. And ultimately, 2016 on, and then escalating during the pandemic, they decided to take a stronger stance on some of this stuff.
Well, of course, in the pandemic, false information can get people killed. They die if they believe things that are not true and they follow bad advice. Their families could lose their lives for listening to things that are presented as medical information.
Yeah, and Twitter was very aware of that responsibility. So they did take stronger steps during the pandemic. A lot of people thought too little, too late. But then particularly we saw the January 6th insurrection. That was kind of the ultimate breaking point, where employees had been calling for years for management to take a stronger stance against Donald Trump, because he had used the platform so masterfully to spread his narrative, a lot of which was factually inaccurate regarding the vote and the election in particular. And then when the riot happened, Twitter employees basically demanded that they finally boot him off the platform. Jack Dorsey really didn't want to do this, so he ultimately decides on a suspension of about 3 days, I believe. Donald Trump then comes back and starts breaking the rules yet again, and then he's kicked off the platform entirely. And this actually becomes kind of a key reason that Elon Musk gets interested in buying the company, because he really feels like Twitter has been what he calls like overtaken by the woke mind virus. God knows what that means. But in his mind, it was sliding in a bad direction and he needed to save it.
Yes, I suppose we now have to introduce your own main character in a way. You do emphasize in the book that it is not a biography of Elon Musk, but sadly, Elon Musk has made it so that we cannot help but discuss this man. What leads him to get involved with this company? I mean, he's always been a prolific tweeter, I take it.
Yeah, he was kind of involved as like a fan and as a power user. There was like a famous moment to employees, at least in 2020, when everyone came together for an all hands meeting. Like Jack Dorsey had flown everyone out to Houston, Texas, and they had this big party. And as part of his kind of big rallying speech, he gets on stage, Jack Dorsey does, and he actually FaceTimes Elon Musk and asks him for advice on like how they should make Twitter better. And so in kind of a very informal sense, he's been involved. But two things happen that really start to change the tide. Actually, three. One is that Elon Musk's eldest daughter, who is trans, started to move away from her father. She stopped speaking to him. Ultimately, she actually petitions the court for a name change and says she doesn't want to be associated with her father in any way. And Elon blames this, for whatever reason, on the elite private school that she'd gone to in Los Angeles, and says that the school is overrun by the woke mind virus. It had infected his daughter, and this was the reason that she had turned against him. When Twitter kicks off Donald Trump, yet again, this is the woke mind virus. Twitter is overrun by the woke mind virus, and he needs to get involved. Then, and this is kind of like his decision-making, which seems to happen largely on a whim, he sells a bunch of Tesla stock, and he has about $10 billion like burning a hole in his pocket. And he's thinking, what should I do with all this money? You know, Elon Musk's ambitions are very global. It's not like, what can he do for fun? It's like, how can he have this massive, massive impact? And he thinks that saving Twitter, in quotes, is the way to do that. And so he starts buying up Twitter shares.
This man has what we might call a unique psychology. You quote the journalist Kara Swisher saying that her understanding is that he believes that if he didn't exist, the world would die, which is just a remarkable level of egotism. I mean, off the chart. The other thing in what you said there is it struck me that some people, if their daughter was trans and didn't want to be associated with them, might look at their daughters not wanting to be associated with them and ask themselves some questions about whether they had been the optimal parent. It is very, very odd to go in the other direction and say, there is a virus and that I now have to destroy by buying this company. It's a really, really odd reaction to that personal situation.
It is an odd reaction. There was a great quote, and Ronan Farrow did an incredible piece in The New Yorker on Elon Musk's political influence. And there was this one line in it where one of his associates was quoted as saying, Elon Musk desperately wants to save the world, but only if he can be the person to save it. And that, I think, encapsulates his mindset so beautifully. He does have this immense preoccupation with humanity and saving humanity, but he sees himself as a key player in that fight to save it.
Yes, and if he can't be the person, then the world can go to hell.
Yeah.
You know, he talks in these early stages about the importance of free speech, free speech, free speech. This is what comes up over and over, is that Twitter's content moderation violates the basic principles of free speech. It comes across very strongly that the actual principle of free speech is not really something that he is personally committed to in a way that we can respect.
Yeah, his definition of free speech seems to be like his speech and the speech of people in his circle. When it's journalists who are speaking about something that he doesn't like, he's been known to boot them off the platform. When there's been a lot of examples now of X, as it's now known, caving to foreign governments at a rate far higher than its predecessor. And so I think that definition is very flimsy. At the same time, it's almost laughable for anyone who has written about or participated in social platforms. This idea that you come in and you're a free speech absolutist, it just always ends up in kind of the same space, because however much you believe that principle, and I think we can, have serious questions about whether Elon even does believe that principle, you can't be a free speech absolutist and own a global social platform. What about child sexual exploitation material? What about misinformation about the vote? What about harassment? Also, when you open up the gates, and any early Twitter user could have told him this, and you allow anyone to say anything, you actually limit the speech of the vast majority of users, because it's not safe to speak online if every time you speak, you receive a deluge of death threats and harassment. You need some level of content moderation, both from a legal perspective, but also just to be a place that's not overrun in AI-generated nude images of a celebrity, which the average person probably doesn't want to see.
Yes, it strikes me as something that people probably tried to explain to him before he bought the platform, that he probably waved away.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most surprising things to me, was just like the remarkable lack of curiosity that he came in the room with. He didn't come into Twitter asking a lot of questions or wanting to learn from employees. His stance, and I really say this based on my reporting, not on my personal feelings, was like, all of you people are idiots and I don't really want to hear what you have to say. And I think when you come in with that stance, it's very hard to get things right, because the people who worked at Twitter, whether you agree with them or not, they had labored over these questions for years and years, and they've made mistakes and learned from them. But he was not willing to have those conversations, it seemed like.
Yes, if you buy a company and you sit down with an employee and you think, I don't understand what it is that you do, employee, here at this company, there's one approach that says, well, I need to ask the person and I need to better understand what that person does around here, because clearly there's a lot I have to learn about this company I've just bought. And there's another approach that says, I can't understand what they do. They must be useless. They should be fired. And it does strike me that Elon Musk's attitude towards things he doesn't understand is much more in the then we can probably get rid of them side of things.
Yeah, and Tesla and SpaceX, it's worth pointing out that he has so many people in the room who know exactly what they're doing. They're experts on building electric vehicles or rockets. And so he doesn't necessarily need to be the ultimate expert. He can kind of come in, make management decisions. Sometimes he'll be on the line, making decisions, and he has an intuitive understanding of the facts, but that's enough in a lot of those circumstances. But at Twitter, he lacks empathy. He will say this himself. His brother says that he got the empathy gene in the family and Elon did not. And so his intuition, I think, for a social platform is just not as accurate. And he was the one who was involved in those decisions. He wasn't delegating except to his lieutenants, most of whom also had not worked at a global social platform and were coming in with a similar posture to him of hubris, what I would say.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
There's a certain satisfaction almost, maybe it's a bad part of me, that I get seeing, him buying this platform and then having to engage day to day with people going, look at this bad decision. Look at this bad content moderation decision. He's like, I'll get involved in that. And you think now he's gotten himself in a situation where he is now making all of these decisions that could have been made by other people with expertise. And it's like, well, you brought this upon yourself. Now this is your life. Now you have to deal with this platform that you bought.
I write about this in the book that he thought he was buying Twitter, but what he was buying in reality was like the biggest content moderation challenge that the world had seen at that point. Like he was buying an enormous headache, and I don't think he was fully prepared to take that on, which is why X looks remarkably different, the same in terms of the feature set, but I would say the quality of the conversation is very different from what it used to be.
Now, you mentioned that it is now officially called X. I don't think many people, I don't think that's caught on very well, try as they may. They purged the birds, no birds allowed anywhere. You don't even tweet anymore, you just post. This seemed a very weird decision. I mean, you've got a global brand. Everyone knows what a tweet is. It's in the dictionary.
Yeah, no, I know. It was a lot of brand equity and brand recognition to destroy overnight. But this had actually been his plan from the outset. You know, one of his first startups was called X.com, and he was eventually pushed out of that merged company, which became PayPal, and had, I think, a certain amount of obsession with the letter X. One of his kids is named X, along with a string of other characters, which I haven't memorized. But he really, after that kind of early failure, harbored this vision of a platform called X that would kind of combine payments and social aspects. And this became more and more true as the internet shifted to being more mobile. And so from the moment that he decided to buy Twitter, he was saying, this is my chance to resurrect X, this long-standing dream that he had had. And he really disliked the kind of touchy-feely, kind of fun, quirky vibe that Twitter had. He disliked how the office looked, how the logo looked, how the blue was kind of friendly looking. And so he was always going to overhaul all of those things.
Well, everything has to look like the Cybertruck. It's got to be all post-apocalyptic and bleak and industrial and miserable.
Yeah, there's this great moment. The Twitter office was extremely beautiful, light-filled. There was like a Black Lives Matter mural on the wall right when you walked in. And there was this early moment in the acquisition where employees walked into the front lobby, and there used to be these framed iconic tweets on the wall, kind of big moments in Twitter's history. And someone had swapped out the tweets that were displayed. And instead of, hello world, the first tweet ever sent by Twitter, it was, next, I'm buying Coca-Cola and putting the cocaine back in. And it was a tweet that Elon Musk had sent. And it was it had been just like printed out really poorly and was missing all of the metadata. But like the statement was so clear that the office today is going to look very, very different from what it used to.
Did they do that because he instructed them to do that? Or was that people trying to please him?
That was the question. And I think either way, it's very funny. Did he look around and say, I want one of my tweets displayed? Or did one of his sycophantic followers just say like, ooh, I know what will make him very happy is if we like print this out on butcher paper and then frame it really poorly on the wall.
Because you do note in the book that he was very clear that he wanted to have Twitter's internal architecture modified so that the words that he decided to post would be put in front of the eyeball. When you buy a company, it is your right to defy the usual algorithm determining what people might be interested in and subvert it and replace it with an Elon Musk-based special algorithm. I mean, this is an actual thing that he made people do.
Yeah, he really does think of himself as a quality control guy. And this might have worked at Tesla engineers would say, like, he would drive to work and have all this feedback about his car, and they would make little tweaks and specifications to improve his driving experience. But that tweak and modification doesn't impact all of the other Tesla drivers who might not want the exact same thing as Elon Musk. Unfortunately, when you make those tweaks and modifications on Twitter, what he wants is maximum attention. That automatically does make everyone else's experience a little bit worse. And this was kind of his number one priority in December, January, February of early 2023. He's seen a decline in his popularity, and he's convinced that it's sabotage, that an engineer has like planted a bug in the algorithm to suppress his posts or his tweets. And engineers, data scientists, everyone tries to tell him like, look, it's not that, you're just not as popular as he used to be. But even his cousin, who's working at Twitter at the time, says, I know that the data says that, but I trust Elon's intuition more than the data. And so ultimately, they're forced to make this change.
I mean, he's a genius. So, by the way, I have something that has made my Twitter experience better than ever before, and I highly recommend to everyone listening, is mute Elon Musk. You can mute him. You don't have to listen. You don't have to see a single thing he says ever again. I'm shocked that he didn't eliminate the ability to mute him, but it is still there right now, and it's an improvement.
Are you still using the platform like you used to, or has it changed?
I have to use it because, we're a small independent outlet. We got to promote stuff. I feel like I do the same thing I always did.
But do you notice that engagement has declined, or does it feel about steady?
Yes, with articles. It's actually a huge problem and actually, we can discuss this because he seems to have made, maybe you know more about the actual decision-making process here, but he definitely removed headlines from articles and has seen it as like articles that send people onto a news organization's website are parasitic on Twitter because they're taking them away. And so it's been much, much harder to get people to get pieces of journalism from our publication to get any attention.
Yeah. No, I think there's no question. I mean, he has enormous antipathy towards the mainstream press, and this definition of his includes basically all journalistic or classic journalistic outlets. And I think there's been an enormous deprioritization of news on X and even a downranking of links, like you said.
Yeah, although Facebook is pretty similar there too. I think they have, it's been a real challenge.
Yeah, Threads says it doesn't, but they're not leaning into news, they've said also. So.
Yeah, so tell me more about how in some ways, after, a year of Elon Musk owning it, time goes by now, so I lose track of it. But year and a half, in some ways, it seems like not much has changed. He introduced you have to pay if you want two-factor authentication now, which seems a stupid policy. But a lot of it seems like maybe it hasn't changed as much as we might have expected. It hasn't turned into X, some weird, what he called the everything app. It's just Twitter, but without the bird. But in another way, it has changed a lot. So tell me more about what has changed.
Yeah, I'm trying not to over-prioritize my own experience because I feel like it has become a lot more toxic and there's a lot more misinformation. But I know, when I talk to journalists in other countries, they say it seems very similar to us than it used to. So I don't know how much of this is my own experience and how much of it is true across the board. But one thing I will say is that X's cultural relevance, I think, has declined enormously. You can see this on a few different metrics, but I think, when outlets like NPR are completely off X and posting on other platforms, I think that's a significant shift from a platform that used to be the primary way that news was distributed online. And then also with kind of high profile users and celebrities, I think there's a big shift away from X. This isn't true for everyone, but I think when you loosen the reins on content moderation, you allow maximum speech for high profile users in particular. That's a lot less attractive because they're already getting kind of a lot of hate mail, a lot of harassment. And so to get more of that and open the floodgates and actually say that that is okay makes it a lot less stable for a high profile individual.
And didn't he do some disastrous things like when he said, you got to pay if you want your blue check mark? He seemed to antagonize some of the most well-known people who are the draws to the platform, who essentially create free content for it. And he said, I'm going to get your $8 if you want your verification. And they're like, well fuck off. We don't need that.
Again, though, this is because he has such disrespect for journalism and journalists. And that felt like a clear example. If you supposedly verification was for high profile people who were at risk of being impersonated, but if you worked at any large outlet, as you know, you could get verified really quickly, even if you were just starting out in your journalism career. And this really rubbed him the wrong way. He is a fan of what he calls citizen journalism. He doesn't support mainstream media. And so he felt like in taking away the blue check, it was a way to kind of ideally boost X's revenue. This didn't actually happen because not enough people signed up at the time, but at the same time kind of punish the mainstream press. But when we think about cultural relevance, just think about the cultural significance of the blue check mark. It used to mean that you were a journalist, a high profile person, you were someone legitimate. It wasn't always true, but it was a pretty good indicator of those attributes. Now it essentially means that you're a fan of Elon Musk a lot of the time. And the ranking algorithm is such that it prioritizes tweets from blue check marks. And in moments of crisis, what we've seen is that those accounts are the ones spreading misinformation about what's going on in Gaza, for example, or in Israel. And we're seeing the platform dynamics just totally shift because of this product decision that he made.
Well, what's extraordinary, and it seems strange in some ways to dwell on the significance of blue check marks. It seems like such a small, who gets a blue check mark on Twitter. On the other hand, what had happened was, as you say, they'd built up such cachet that implicitly, when you read Twitter and you see the blue check mark, you kind of assume that it's coming from someone credible, but he flipped it. So the check marks are still there, but now they're just people who are not credible at all. And I've seen like horrible anti-Semitic, racist posts coming from people with blue check marks because they bought them. And there's something where, like, for years, any user of the platform, your mind had built up this association with, oh, okay, this is probably coming from a news outlet. This is probably, if not completely true, then at least not just being made up randomly by someone. And now the stuff that's made up randomly has like a verification badge.
Completely. Yeah, it was so ironic. I mean, in the days that followed, you saw some celebrities who Elon Musk had actually chosen to let accounts with, I believe, over 1 million followers retain the blue check, whether or not they paid for it, at least a lot of accounts. And celebrities were on there saying, I didn't pay for my blue check, because it had become overnight such a mark of embarrassment almost, that they wanted to make it really, really clear that they didn't choose to have it on their profile.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that business-wise, a lot of this decisions that he has made have not been good for Twitter. What has happened to Twitter as a business?
Yeah. So as we said, like, Twitter wasn't the most profitable tech company of all time. It had really struggled in this area of growth, but it wasn't in dire straits either. The cyclical ads market was always going to bounce back. And so they would have low moments and then high moments, and they had enough in the bank to kind of weather the storms. But this changed overnight when Elon Musk bought the company, because he saddled it with billions of dollars in debt. And thus the intense interest in like cutting costs in every way possible right from the outset. Unfortunately, Elon Musk has said blatantly that he hates advertisers and advertising. So one of his core goals was to shift the revenue model away from advertising and towards subscription. That's why Twitter Blue was the model of tying verification to a subscription was his kind of big project that he launched shortly after taking over the company. But Twitter Blue was a disaster for a bunch of reasons, one of which is just that when you allow anyone with $8 to buy a blue checkmark, the platform can be overrun with kind of scammers and impersonators. This happened. And then the other issue was just that not a lot of people bought the subscription. For the first kind of 6 or 8 months, they were kind of looking at the sign-up rates and they were pretty anemic. There were little events that would kind of spike this, but overall, it was a flop in terms of helping shift that model. And so he's been forced to kind of make nice with advertisers. But as we've seen time and again, Elon Musk is basically incapable of not saying what he thinks.
Is that what constitutes making nice?
I mean,
I think he told them, didn't he give them the finger and say, I don't care, go away,
He told them to go F themselves, yes. But in hiring Linda Yaccarino, that was a moment of clear acceptance that advertising was going to be very important, because that's her bread and butter. And so you could see that he was making decisions in a manner of acknowledging what the problems were and what needed to be done to fix them. At the same time, he continues to piss off advertisers and scare them away.
What's frustrating about Elon Musk's position as the wealthiest man in the world is that there is no discipline on him whatsoever. The market doesn't discipline someone like that, because ultimately, like, if he breaks this platform that some people liked and used for their jobs, and a lot of people suffer as a result, like, he doesn't have to care. All the advertisers could go away. This thing could go up in flames, and he's got his other companies. It doesn't matter. He can break his little toy.
Yeah, I mean, this is why with Tesla in particular, like, he's cultivated fandoms so intensely. Like, Tesla's stock prices always kind of outpaced its business. And that's because I think it's one of the most popular retail stocks for individuals to buy, because he has so many fans. So kind of regardless of what he does, if he jokes about taking the company private and he doesn't actually have the funding secured, if he calls someone online a pedophile who's clearly not, Like his fans support him no matter what. And they help to buoy the stock price through all of these kind of mini scandals.
Because, the SEC could fine him $20 million. Well, he makes like $300 million in a day or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of my theory about the future of X. And this is just a theory, but I think that it will subsumed by XAI, which is his new artificial intelligence company that he's creating. And Twitter or X will become an input to train the large language models. But I think his focus is more and more going to shift toward artificial intelligence.
Okay, I'm sure that's going to be wonderful. Oh, I did want to mention one more thing, which is this treatment of the people who work at Twitter, because it seems pretty bad.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like I said, he came into the room really dismissive of people's expertise and wanting to cut costs as quickly as possible. And so he fired half the company right away. He took away most of their perks. He cut maternity leave from 20 weeks down to the legal minimum plus a top off of 2 weeks. So he really does kind of link worker power, which had started to grow during the pandemic in particular. I think we saw tech workers unionizing and getting concessions from bosses in a way that they hadn't historically. He really links that to, again, the woke mind virus. And suddenly, if you want to be able to have a flexible working environment because you're a parent and you have to take, or a caretaker of any sort, and you have other responsibilities, that is a sign that you are lazy and lefty and you don't want to work hard. And basically you're not extremely hardcore, for lack of a better term. And the company that he's creating is the opposite of that. It's fast, efficient. It's full of people who will work their asses off and work all night and day and are willing to kind of do what it takes to make X successful.
Or just to carry out every one of his whims.
Carry out his bidding. Yeah.
Now, just to conclude here, your book is fun, I think. You read it, and it's a fun story in many ways. And the great Matt Levine calls it a fast-paced and riveting account of a hilarious and tragic mess. It is indeed a hilarious and tragic mess. We can read it as just a crazy story, but it does strike me, and you don't dwell too much on the wider kind of political implications to this story. As I read this, it does strike me as an illustration of the dangers of having concentrated wealth and power, so that you can have a guy who has not a shred of empathy, who is like a child, who is malevolent and bigoted and believes in conspiracy theories and hates and is transphobic and is just a deeply, deeply unpleasant person in a position of such power that they control access to one of the most, and can destroy, if they want to, access to a really important part of the public square.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one key takeaway for me from this whole thing is just like the open internet is fragile and it's really susceptible to billionaires like Elon Musk, who can come in and just buy huge swaths of it and change it to their liking. I mean, arguably, he is the most powerful person in the world who's not in control of a nuclear arsenal that we know of.
So far, give it time.
So far. And there are very, very few checks on his power, like you said. And I think that puts all of us in a precarious position because he doesn't have to operate by the same rules as the rest of us. And yet his actions have enormous consequences.
Well, to read about those actions and their consequences, our listeners and readers should pick up the book Extremely Hardcore Inside Elon Musk's Twitter, available from Portfolio. Zoe Schiffer, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
This was really fun. Thank you for having me.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.